Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for coming back to Listening In, the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society podcast. In this series, we want to give you the opportunity to listen in to some of the conversations that we are lucky enough to have every day, that is, with a variety of people and organisations all working in the field of mental health and well-being. Please be aware there is a brief mention of suicide in this episode. Gemma Khairi is the Director of Operations with Helplines Partnership. With around 350 members, Helplines Partnership is the membership body for organisations that provide information, support or advice via phone, email, text or online. Gemma and her colleagues work to maintain standards. They offer training, advice and support across the helpline sector. With a kind and generous father who raised Gemma and her brothers alone, Gemma witnessed the art of compassion from an early age as her dad worked to support people in the community as well as caring for Gemma and her siblings, including her disabled brother. And maybe as a natural extension of those formative years, Gemma went on to study human rights and social justice, which then took her into a variety of roles, working alongside some of the most vulnerable people in society. Young care leavers, young offenders, street sex workers and people living with HIV. Specialising in working with children and young people, Gemma then went to Childline, which was her first experience of what it's like to run a successful helpline. And now with that wealth of experience and knowledge behind her, as well as her own innate desire to support others, Gemma finds herself in her current role. I really hope you find our conversation as interesting as I did. Gemma gives us a glimpse behind the scenes of taking a call on a helpline and the intricacies and the complexities of this type of work. There are stark differences between the relationships created in a therapeutic setting and the one-off, sometimes distressing, sometimes anonymous crisis calls that helpline staff may deal with. We discuss the pitfalls of burnout, compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, as well as the things that can be done personally and professionally to mitigate those inevitable hazards of this type of work. It's estimated that there will be well in excess of over 60 million calls to helplines annually, according to old data. And thanks to Gemma and the team at Helplines Partnership and all those they support, we can feel confident in referring loved ones and clients for the help they need. I think there will potentially be many people listening to this that have not necessarily aware of Helplines Partnership. So before we go into anything else, is it okay just to ask you like a brief overview of what Helplines Partnership is and what it does? And then we can sort of come into more personal, looking at, how you've ended up doing your work with them. So,
yeah. So, Helplines Partnership are basically, in a very kind of brief way of explaining it, are a membership body for all helplines across the sector. Now, so we currently have around 350 members, and although they are members of ours, that doesn't mean we don't work with other helplines outside of our membership, because we are considered as voice of the sector. Mm-hmm. So that there's thousands of other helplines out there. It just may be that it may be a funding issue as to why they can't kind of join HLP family, or it could be that it's, in terms of kind of their need for training or their need for any aspects of what we provide is just not right for them at the moment. So they just dip in and out as and when they wish to. Now, we're not a regulator of the helpline sector, and that's really important to point out. But what we are, and what we are very, very kind of passionate about is driving quality in the sector, because you yourself and some of your listeners will know that when you're working with, vulnerable adults, young people, some children, because there are helplines out there that work with children, you have duty of care and a real responsibility in terms of your practice. So we provide something called the Helpline Standard accreditation. And what that means is helplines that choose to be part of that will be assessed, and we'll look at everything in operations, safeguard pathways, your complaints procedures, HR, anything you can think of, we will look at, and we will see, what sort of best practice is in place. Very much, in particular, supervision, how they look after the staff well-being, because that's a real key issue in the helpline sector and any care and helping sector, really. So that's one of the main things that we do. And we see that as having, a real influence over, best practice then, that can kind of feed into staff, feed into the teams, and so that goes on. We also provide a lot of training specific to the helpline sector. That being said, we do actually train non-helpline sector groups, individuals as well, and we've seen a sharp increase in that. I would say, particularly in the last 5 to 6 years and post-COVID. And obviously we provide consultancy, so anything to do with, kind of policies, or going in and maybe kind of doing observations around the operations and seeing where there's, improvements that could be made, to workshops or strategy workshops. So we're quite diverse in what we offer.
Yeah.
But the key aim is to obviously improve quality and ensure the teams we work with that we offer our advice in terms of how you have not just best practice, but a really good culture as well. That's something that's really important to us.
Yeah. So it's just sort of clarify that. So what you're talking about is driving up standards, maintaining standards, offering support. And I know that's a big part of what you do. And as you've just alluded to, ensuring that culture and staff well-being are all really kept in mind by the helplines that are run as well, because, and I'm sure we'll come on to that, similarly, sort of counsellors and psychotherapists, many of the people that work on helplines are listening to some really difficult and having some really difficult conversations for their work, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And there's some key areas that I would say are most popular, that helplines tend to kind of tap into. As you would imagine, engagement skills. And we kind of start with basic listening skills and active listening, which obviously, yourself with that, you recognise that's the very basic of engagements, but so important that a lot of people don't have. And it can really help, not just in your professional life, but in your personal kind of interactions as well. So we start with that, and then we've got 3 tiers to that. We move into kind of moderate, intermediate, and then we go into more advanced. Where it's a little bit unique with the helpline sector is this is kind of catered around the types of calls and the types of interactions that you may have. So if you have face-to-face interactions, you have the benefit of, the tone of somebody's voice, but you also you can see the face. You can pick up if something is amiss, or, nuances. I think you little kind of points of contact that you can kind of say, oh, I might just kind of maybe go down this route, or I might avoid that because I'm sensing there's a little bit of a, pushback there. And in terms of safeguarding as well, I think it's really important to say you're much more protected and have much more options, I would say, believe it or not, in a face-to-face context, because your policies are very particular, and obviously it's borne out within, whether it's your counselling practice or whether you're working within an organisation, and it's very clear. And obviously I know from personal experience, you have your contracts before you engage in your counselling practices and those sorts of things, and they're very protective. In the helpline sector, it's much more complex, I would say, and a little bit more difficult, because dependent on how somebody chooses to engage, it could be a web chat, it could be an email, which is not a live interaction. And even with traditional telephone, you can't view or see the person. And there's been many occasions where people have come through on calls, have explained who they are, so, gender, age, and we found out later on that that may not have been the case, because they wanted to protect their anonymity to that level that they may have. So even from a point of view as a practitioner, we all do it. We all kind of, form images and people in our minds, and the information you are given, your brain subconsciously will form that image, and maybe kind of, and it's those it's those biases that we have, and you just have to recognize it and then kind of work yourself backwards. That's okay, as long as you recognize that. But when you are working sometimes in the unknown, you're having to use a lot more of your senses, and I would say, really steer away from making assumptions, because it can get you into more trouble I would say in the helpline sector than it can in a face-to-face. I mean, we should never make assumptions, but it's much more layered, I would say, and you just got to tread carefully.
That's fascinating, Gemma. I hadn't even thought of the fact that somebody calling a helpline for whatever reason may still feel the need to remain anonymous to such an extent that they will provide that false information. And of course, I suppose for counsellors and psychotherapists, many of us will be used to perhaps doing telephone counselling. It's a method I particularly enjoy. I really love it for all the reasons you've just said. It's such a different way of working. I actually find it a very intimate way of working. And you notice other things, don't you? The way somebody's breathing or the pauses, and yes, you're not getting that visual body language, but you're using other cues. But of course, the difference for us is, for the most part, in most situations, this person that we will be working with is presenting, as themselves. And the chances are, all being well, that we will see them through, form a relationship. And it's a process with a beginning, a middle, and an end, as it were. Whereas, of course, I understand with some helplines, at least, this could just be a one-off call sometimes. It's not necessarily this relationship building. And so, how different that is, and that safeguarding is that you describe, and that understanding that who you think you're talking to may not be exactly who is on the other end of the phone. That's so interesting. Yeah. It
changes again when you go to web chat as well, and everything that you are taught, so reflective listening, you then have to explain to the volunteer or staff member, okay, I want you to now unlearn that section somewhat, because if you use too much reflection in a web chat, you sound like a robot. They think you're a chatbot, that you're picking up on the words and you're just reflecting back. So you have to use it sparingly, sensitively, carefully. And so this is where there's this misconception about, people may think that if you work on a helpline and you're one of the counsellors on a helpline, that actually your skill set level is low. It's actually really high. And it's, ongoing training is so important, because you are dealing with people at their most vulnerable. And, if you think about, one of the things that I would love to really get into is much more research and data around helplines, because there's not a lot that's been done. And there was some done in, I think it was 2011, where it was reported that there was 60 million calls taken in a year alone across the helpline sector. Now, if you think that's 2011 and what we know about COVID and what we know about non-traditional helplines. So when we talk about non-traditional, we talk about call contact centres in the commercial sector, solicitors, construction, you name it. We have seen a huge shift and an increase in those sorts of sectors are starting to experience high levels of crisis calls and suicidal calls. And I think in 2019 it was 55% of helplines alone, so that's not even including all of that commercial sector, reported an increase in crisis calls and suicidal calls. 55%. That was 2019. I would say if research was done now, that would be up again. I know it would be because you get a sense, obviously, the work we do with helplines. And I think working in a helpline and, you have to be prepared for all sorts of situations. I recall supporting a counsellor who's a volunteer, but receives lots of training, lots of input. And they were on a call and there was a young boy and he wished to end his life. So you're trying to, you're trying to keep that young person engaged. You're supporting the counsellor to do that. They may, in that moment, freeze a little. It's a new experience for them. They feel tension. I could sense there was tension in the body. So even something as simple as putting my hand on the shoulder and trying to, ground them, be aware of your body, I'm writing little notes, you tense your body, breathe, try to relax your shoulders, and just that touch can sometimes, practical kind of sensory things can help. You're then trying to support them in how they, as you're listening to the call, you can hear what's taking place, trying to kind of relax them, because obviously then it flows a lot better. As you know, the more tense we are, the more we forget, we kind of go into maybe panic mode. So, it's kind of multi-layered. And then there's the point of interaction where whilst I'm doing that, I'm also then looking and hearing for any sounds. So there's by a bridge, there's water, and you're hearing like outside noises. You can hear the odd car in the background. So you're broadening your senses because you need to risk assess on a different level. So if I'm sat in a room and, I may be counselling a young person or an adult, obviously I'm using my senses slightly differently in that moment because you're tuned into the individual, but you've got a lot of the, cues that you wouldn't have. In a situation like that, you're managing the volunteer, their anxieties. You want them to be, this is going to be good for them long term because it will build some resilience and they've been exposed to it. But it has to be managed carefully so that this exposure does not then send them in a much more negative space of mind. And you want the best outcome for that child at that time, and that is the key. So there's a combination of factors that need to work there. Good skills, good practice, a very supportive environment, a good supervisor supporting the volunteer on the call, to ensure that kind of the cycle of empathy is there from young person to counsellor to supervisor, and then potentially on-call manager if you then have to, breach confidentiality and you have to go down the road of working with what we call the SPOC, the liaison officers, the specialist officers in the police, whereby they will initiate the trace. And that is not an easy thing to actually go into as well. So in that interaction, that whole helpline room, you're counselling, you're then risk assessing, you're then writing kind of risk assessment notes, you're then a referrer, then you're liaising with police, potentially ambulance service. Once that's, kind of completed, you're then having to make sure we need some adequate debriefs here.
Yeah.
person cannot leave without a debrief. There can be kind of resistance to that. I just want to go home. I'm tired. I'm drained. It's taken its toil on them. And it's how you explain, but it's very important that you don't take that home with you. And just a mini debrief that night will not be enough. There'd have to be something after that, maybe, like a group supervision or a bigger debrief. But in that moment, something that can kind of allow them to express how that call made them feel and what was the impact. So you then act as a facilitator. So when I say it's complex and it's layered, that's what I mean, if that gives you an example.
Oh, it's absolutely. I mean, it's unbelievable the work that you are all doing in that. You're giving a really brilliant you're painting a really great picture of not only the work, but the systems, the people within that whole process. And again, I'm mindful of my fellow professionals. So we will all be familiar with suicidality, suicidal ideation, and what we need to do in that if we're working with a client who's feeling that way. But it's going to be really very unusual for us to be in that live situation with somebody while they are in the act of considering doing it in that moment. And I mean, I can barely imagine, what that's like. It was really touching, actually, just to hear you talk about just that hand on the shoulder. I'm really familiar with that. I do that obviously with consent, with permission, and it's very rare, but sometimes I'll do that with clients if they've, become very distressed or upset or whatever. And sometimes it will be like, how would you feel if I just came and sat alongside you? So sometimes I'll just sit next to them, so I'm not sat there, looking at them. And then, again, depending who it is, depending on how they're feeling, I might say, how about if I just put, and I'll just sort of rest a hand on their back will be what I tend to do. Like I say, in very rare circumstances, but sometimes just that simple feeling, sense of touch, isn't it? Like you say, grounds people, can bring them down. I want us to come back to some of that work, Gemma. You've already done such a brilliant job, I think, of helping us understand the differences in what you do. And I should actually say as well, for people that don't know, when you're talking about your membership or helplines that you support, it's not just mental health helplines. There's all manner of different ones. And again, we can come back to that. But yeah, you've really helped us understand, the nature of the work, the complexity of the work, and the differences compared to what somebody like myself might do. But really interesting is how any of us end up doing the job we do. And I just wondered if it would be okay to just sort of ask you about your background and what your path has been that's brought you to this point of working for Helplines Partnership in your current role.
So I think it's important. So, I mean, you can talk about personalities and our likes and dislikes and those sorts of things, but we are shaped by our childhood, 100%. And I think, without going into too much detail, but one of the two main key areas for me that I think by the time I was 14, maybe, that I knew I wanted to be in the helping sector, to help people was where my calling was. And that came from, I would say, my dad and my brother. So my brother had something called Friedreich ataxia, and he was only meant to live till he was 21. He lived till 38. He actually kind of broke the record. I think it was unheard of at the time. But so I was a young carer from the age of 5, 6, and my dad was a single parent, so he looked after myself and obviously my brother, who was in a wheelchair and had some issues. So my dad was an incredibly kind, generous, caring soul. Originally from Malaysia, settled in Liverpool in his 20s, and he's been there ever since. So he was actually a carer. He cared for the elderly in the community and people who had obviously had accidents, needed rehabilitation. So he was a carer. So, you know, Christmas Day for us was kind of split into two halves. So in the morning, he would be up very early and he would be cooking about 10 Christmas dinners for clients that he knew didn't have any family and would have no contact that day. So I would help, you know, prep. We'd wrap them, prep them, and then we would go around and deliver the meals to all of his clients. And that would have been the only contact from anyone they would have had that day. No family, no friends. But he was a great cook as well, fabulous cook. So, you know, that's how he showed us kind of, you know, he showed us love through food as well. So we would deliver the food round. We'd spend a little bit of time with each of them, and then only when we got home at 2-3 o'clock in the afternoon would our Christmas day begin. Then, so then he would be back in the kitchen, and he would cook whatever, you know, he was going to be for us, and it was much more chilled. So I think from an early age, my dad instilled really good values into me, and something I've always lived by. It's, you know, I don't have a religion, but if you were to say, what do you live by? My values is what drives me, and that's kind of my ground and my cornerstone as well. So I think it was inevitable. You know, I kind of went down the path of social sciences, psychology, that side of things. And then from that, I didn't want to be a social worker or, you know, a specific role. I wanted something much more diverse, and I wanted to be exposed to diversity because that's my whole life had been, you know, kind of geared that way. And I just felt as though it made you a much more rounded person and give you a much more rounded worldview as well. And not that there was anything wrong with a single profession. It just wasn't the path for me, and I knew that early on. So I began my master's in criminology, human rights and social justice because those things, again, it fed directly into my values. So justice and, you know, equality and fairness for all was something that was really key to me. And I was on my way to being a criminologist or a forensic psychologist. That's what I was considering at the time. But something happened during my master's. I took a major in children and mental health, and that was it. Then that was kind of diverted off into that section, and it's something that stayed with me. So children mental health and obviously child protection is ran right throughout my career. It's something I'm really passionate about. So from there, left university, put myself in various kinds of, you know, sessional style roles. Went to a support, you know, housing scheme, and there was actually a large proportion of Schedule 1 offenders. So I was 21, and I was working with high-end Schedule 1 offenders. So, you know, people that very dangerous, very complex. But learned a lot and had some experiences there. And I know we've discussed this before, but one of my passions was I volunteered at a HIV charity, and I did that for 7 years alongside any study or any job I had. And again, it's one of those, a group that's marginalised in society, but a lot of misconceptions around that. And I think it kind of directly related to the sense of social injustice and, you know, those that are kind of misinterpreted. So yeah, I did that for 7 years. I then also went out and did some outreach work with street sex workers. And then I fell into running a supported housing scheme for young care leavers in particular. And the 5 young men that I worked with over a 2 to 3 year period, there was one young man was dyspraxic, one had mental health conditions, but that was linked in and triggered by excessive ecstasy use.
Okay.
So we always say, obviously, drugs don't create mental health conditions, but they can act as a trigger for anything that potentially may be underlying, or because it's our brains have, got different chemicals, and you are putting chemicals essentially into your system, and it modifies the brain, or can do. And another was incredibly vulnerable, suffered a lot of sexual abuse and trauma throughout his life. So you're working with young people who have got very different needs, very different, and that felt comfortable for me. That's kind of, I was comfortable in that space. I think that's where I think sometimes it led me into that path. And from there, I became a drug and alcohol worker and a counsellor with young people. And so then I would work one-to-one with young people. And these are young people who may have had serious alcohol issues, heroin, cocaine, you name it.
Mm.
And one of the things I found over the years working with those young people was loss was a recurrent theme. And I don't just mean loss as in a death in the family, but these young people experienced multiple losses. So loss of a parent just leaving, loss of potential siblings. Just loss was the underlying, and it really stayed with me, and I got really interested in that. And I think at the time, it was many, many years ago, I read some research around it that there is a direct correlation with loss and kind of, poor mental health. And when you get that repeated kind of loss, and it kind of like upsets your foundations, you that stability, that core need in people.
Mm.
And obviously a lot of the young people I was working with as well, because of the drug and alcohol use, they were kind of maybe being kicked out of the home or back and forth. And so there was no real kind of grounding or stability there. Or the work that you did and the preventative work would go well, but then they would be returned into the same environment, and then the same triggers then are there. And it's so difficult, for anybody, any adult, never mind a young person, to then obviously, maintain the kind of work they've done. And I did that for a while. And I also went into youth offending institutes and prisons. So I worked with some young people who would obviously, had killed other young people.
Gosh.
Had been involved in really traumatic, events where it was serving long sentences. Again, some Schedule 1 style young people as well. So working with those kind of like predatory kind of behaviours and those sorts of things. So I think, I think in particular, because you work with young people, I was more trained in the person-centred and CBT style.
Okay.
Because they respond much better, in that mode. But like yourself, I don't know if you agree with me or not, but every single young person that I worked with, all different. And so you could never go in with the same kind of like, method, pathway. You had to alter, and adjust to that person. I think that's really important. And it's the same on the helpline sector. When people think, well, if I'm taught a certain model or a certain way, I have to stick to that verbatim. And it's like, no, that's your framework. It's like your protective kind of, but you have to respond to what's in front of you. And that is a whole new learning and a different part of your brain, isn't it, that when you're trying to kind of teach that skill or get that through. But that really shaped me. And then from there, I went into the helpline sector. I set up the first childline base in Liverpool.
I didn't know that, Gemma.
Yeah, so we had one in Manchester, and that was our kind of what we'd call our sister base. So I started to work from the Manchester base a little bit. And then I was the first member of staff in Liverpool base. And at the time, NSPCC had a group of social workers that provided a web chat service. And what they did, they brought Childline under the umbrella of NSPCC because it used to stand alone. But they brought NSPCC kind of like took over Childline in that respect, which made sense because, you know, Child Protection Helpline, NSPCC, it was seen as a, you know, really good fit. But you had obviously social workers and then Childline staff who were not social work trained. So they amalgamated. So then I began line managing a group of social workers.
I see.
So you can imagine that you know, there was some resistance there, but it's understandable because it's change, isn't it? Any process of change. And it was two organisations that just operated very differently and just had to get to know each other and get, you know, and mould. And I think at the time, I'd be lying if I didn't say I felt anxiety about line managing social workers. You get that sense of imposter syndrome kicking in. Oh, well, the social worker, well, I'm trained this way, because I took a very different route of training. So although I had maybe the same knowledge, I think sometimes there's a hierarchy within maybe sectors of, well, this is where you need to be, and if you haven't got your social work qualification. So, but that was my own feelings. I had to own that, and I just had an internal dialogue with myself, which is what I've always had, and said, right, just be yourself. Just be yourself and things will work out. Just be yourself, have your boundaries, be empathic, be understanding. So that's what I did. And thankfully, the ones that left, I had a very good relationship with them. And they said, you know, so that it wasn't that there was any, but they moved on back into the field. And a couple of them stayed. And then we started to build the team. So from obviously just me, I think when I left, there was around 170 staff, volunteers, counsellors, and you had to train each cohort of volunteers, and they went through an 11-week course. So the training in Childline is very intensive, and rightly so, because you are going to have access to the most vulnerable children, young people outside of a counselling environment. And you know, some of these children have been physically, sexually abused. They've witnessed and seen significant domestic violence, coerced control. Some homeless. I mean, you name it. We had, you know, an array of all sorts of scenarios. But what was important to me and the people that we brought on board was the support and the practice had to be. So that's something that's always been really important to me wherever I've been. If I need to know that things are being done well, and if they're not, I will do my best to try and improve that. And as a team, you know, we need to be all in it together in that respect. And if somebody isn't, well then, okay, it's my responsibility to find out why that isn't, and help to understand what's a blocker for them. So it grew, and it was we had a lot of support. We had group supervisions. We had a lot of debrief practice. I used to do regular observations in the shifts, because even though things were going well and we were one of the best performing bases, and the culture was good, you can't take it for granted. You have to consistently, you know, it's it's okay reaching a really good space, but consistency is the hardest thing in life.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter about that you've so anyway, I could achieve the helpline standards as a helpline, but the biggest step is me doing that, is us as a team doing that consistently,
sustaining it, yeah, maintaining it, yeah.
That's a whistle stop tour of my professional background. And then it led me to Helplines Partnership because I felt as though I'd done all I could at Childline. It was in a good place. You know, I left it in a really strong position. But I had ideas, I had vision. I wanted to have more influence across the sector as opposed to just one helpline. And so that's where the move to Helplines Partnership came in.
First of all, thank you. Yeah, thank you. It's always really fascinated me how we end up where we are. I want to first of all come all the way back to you talking about your lovely dad. I think when we end up in these supporting roles, caring roles within that type of work, it can be very easy perhaps to believe that that comes from a lived experience and trauma of our own. And of course that is sometimes, part of it. But what stood out to me from what you were saying is something, again, funnily enough, I can really relate to. And that is actually just what you were witnessing, what your dad was modelling for you. And here was this person full of generosity, care, wanting to support and help more vulnerable people. And it sounds like really going out of his way to do that, not just because he was being paid for it in terms of work, but because that was where his heart was. And I grew up in a really similar sort of situation with parents who were, very much a part of supporting, helping within our quite small, it definitely wasn't Liverpool, within a really small community where I live. But it's interesting how that can also feed into perhaps what takes us forward. But I think coming to the other end, what you were just saying about imposter syndrome, it's interesting, isn't it? I think so many of us can really experience that in all different manners and ways and places and for many different reasons. But for you, Gemma, at that point, as somebody listening to what you've just described, it's amazing, because what you've outlined is a wealth and a breadth of knowledge and experience before you got to Childline, line managing a load of social workers. Goodness, the things you must have learnt and experienced and witnessed in all those different forms of work that you had done, voluntary, paid, whatever it was, must have got you to this point of such great understanding and actually empathy as well. I know, that's a very natural, perhaps, trait for many of us, but it doesn't mean to say that we can't continue to nurture that part of ourselves. And I think when you have that diverse breadth of experience and working with lots of different people and understanding reasons for behaviours or difficulties, for me, I don't know, I know we can't speak for everybody, but for me, that really helps make us more empathic, perhaps. I don't know, does that sound a slightly controversial thing to say? I don't know, but I've said it. I don't know. I just think the more we can understand, for the most part, the more empathy that generates, perhaps. and compassion, actually. Maybe that's the word I'm reaching for as well. So by the time you've got to that place, here you are with your imposter syndrome, and yet I'm, imagining this young woman that's just full of all this understanding, empathy and compassion that she's bringing to the role. So, that lived experience versus how other people see us can be two very different things, can't they?
Yeah, definitely. And I am a very open person, so I will express when I have times of difficulty, and every so often throughout, different parts of my life, sometimes I don't know, obviously we haven't, touched on it that much, but I've experienced times where I've had compassion fatigue, or I have thought, I need to switch. I need to maybe leave. And it's not that I need to leave. I kind of take myself through a process, and what I need to do is refuel, re-energize, look after myself, and kind of come back. Because when I do that, the passion hasn't gone. It's just been laying dormant, and then something will trigger me, and I'm like, oh, and then I'm straight back into that energy is there, so the care and I haven't got a choice about that, Faye, and it's going to sound strange, but I don't have a choice about whether I care. It's part of who I am, and I can't switch it off.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what I do, and whether I, was to stay in the helpline sector or go into, another area, but it would have to be something I cared about, or that I was deeply invested in. And so I think when people say you have a vocation and a path, I've had opportunities to maybe go a different path, maybe earn more money, maybe go, traveling to, certain offers that potentially others would say, oh, you're mad. Why didn't you even explore that? And the simple answer is because it's not me, it's not who I am, and it wouldn't make me happy. So you have that internal dialogue and fight with yourself sometimes around those sorts of things. And I just touched on compassion fatigue, and I know we talked about vicarious trauma previous, but again, it's something I'm really tuned into and really kind of keen to share the message about, because it's not just the helping kind of professions like yourself and the helpline sector. We're finding it's coming into other areas. It's coming into much more about society and our communities than people realise. And I think when organisations or certain individuals don't have the right kind of supportive measures in place, over time it can have serious ramifications, and it's producing much more kind of poor mental health in therapists, counsellors, helpline sector, call handlers, because obviously you're that secondary trauma, that could be a one-off, but when we talk about vicarious trauma, that's where your worldview changes, where it's shifting your thinking, and also can make you risk averse, can make you much more risky as a practitioner. Then you kind of like your physical symptoms, just such as sleep, headaches, you start developing health problems. We talk about empathy. If your empathy starts to wane and you start to feel a sense of desensitization, then there is something going on, and that's a bit of a red flag to say, and I maybe need to do something different here within my self-care. But even as practitioners, it's not just for us to do alone. We need help, we need support. We ourselves need somebody to say, stop, and maybe let's see what we do here. Let's see what we can offer the community. Even if, I think for therapists in particular, you can get used to working in isolation. A lot of the time you've got your clients and you book them in, and so if there isn't a conscious effort to have a group somewhere that's maybe set up, clinical supervision will help, but I think you need more than clinical supervision. I think you need group kind of debriefs and certain group settings where a different sort of facilitation takes place. And maybe you're looking at, you know, obviously confidential, of course, but you're looking at some of the stories, the trauma that you hear in a different way, and you're able to explore it from a different angle to try and kind of get that understanding. And there was, so if you know, but there was an interesting stat about therapists, and that 70% of therapists that worked with sexual abuse clients developed vicarious trauma. You know, and so it is a big issue. It's a big issue in the helpline sector as well. But the problem in the helpline sector is that it's hidden a lot of the time. And unless you have measures in place, debriefs, briefings, obviously then, you know, other further support for people after that, it can become a problem. And then what that can lead to is high, you know, risk situations and potentially then putting not just themselves but the caller more harm.
Exactly that.
And so it, you know, and obviously that, you know, yourself, you can understand that as well. So I don't think it's talked about enough in the wider society, and I think it should be, because I think if you have a less empathic, burnt out, stressed helping sector, then we're just going to see more of a mental health crisis than we already have now in the future. It will not get better. And we always say prevention is key, but sometimes the way in which policies and the way in which, you know, kind of the government may react to certain things, it's very reactive as opposed to preventative. And I just think if we don't really understand and take this seriously, I just think, you know, it's not going to send the kind of helping sector in the right direction. You need well practitioners in order to help people, you know, facilitate their own wellness journey and get to a place that they feel they're able to cope, they can develop resilience. But if you're looking across, you know, if you're across a telephone line or a web chat or a face-to-face, and you can see the person that's meant to be facilitating and, you know, helping you, stressed, poor mental health, kind of, you know, taking on that kind of trauma, then it's not a good long-term situation to be in as a society, is it?
Gemma, these are all, it's all such good points, and I couldn't agree more that perhaps it's not only not spoken about enough, but maybe not recognised enough. And what I mean by that is, so it's not just about having, and actually in my mind, I'm thinking of both compassion fatigue, which was such an important point to raise, as well as vicarious trauma. And I think we also need, again, depending on where you are working, your supervisors, your line managers, the people that are looking out for you, to understand enough themselves to spot the signs of these things. Because I think what we can run risk of, and you used the word yourself, I was going to come to it, and then you did mention it as well. I think sometimes we use the word burnout too broadly. We tend to just sort of perhaps run risk of just applying it to everything. Somebody's tired, somebody's struggling a bit, somebody's perhaps not, you know, living up to their own best practice, what they know they can do. And we call it burnout. But actually, burnout is just this broad term for so many other much more important, much more insidious types of experience that we're going through. And of course, vicarious trauma is absolutely one of those. I think actually COVID was a time when perhaps many of us were experiencing that, because it's that classic thing that we were supporting people whilst at the same time going through the exact same experience that those people were as well. So, you know, many I'm going to use the word very broadly, helpers or supporters in whatever context that may be, were living this too, and worried about their own friends and family or their own health, and yet we're having to support people. And I think, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, all of these sorts of things were potentially coming into all of that. It's so important. Maybe there's another conversation for us to have, another episode to record that's just about that in more detail, and something obviously the people that you support and work with, as well as counselling psychotherapist practitioners in their own right, are all experiencing in different ways. I'm really conscious of the time. Oh gosh, and there's still a million questions I want to ask you. I mean, first of all, just to say what's really important, we know now, we've been doing this for a year, and we know there's all manner of different people that listen to this podcast. I suppose we thought, and it probably is a majority of counselling practitioners, but we know actually it's reaching much wider than that. So first of all, just to say that, Helplines partnership for people within my profession or other people, is worth checking out, because we will often be signposting, referring people to those that know their particular sort of diagnosis or experience, thing that they're struggling with, inside out, and we can signpost them to helplines for support or support out of hours when we're not working. And so the Helplines partnership is a great place to go and find those helplines that that you're helping support. But actually, I think what I want to come back to most, if that's okay, is just on the back of what you've just said. So you've talked about caring for ourselves, and that not just being a luxury or something we might do, when we have a moment, but prioritising that, because that's not just for us, that's for those people we support too. There's that knock-on effect. So perhaps a nice question to end on is what you do, if that's okay to ask. What do you do to look after yourself, Gemma? Because you helped us understand perfectly earlier on that there are so many people that you're supporting, your own colleagues, through to the helpline staff, and again, steps removed, the people they're supporting. So what do you two do in your time out to unwind, ground yourself, take care of yourself, re-energise?
So for me, I do go to the gym, but in particular, I weight train.
Okay.
I find, because we're all different, and so what might work for me might not work for you. But
Of course.
But when I weight train, I can feel I need a physical kind of, something that's really pushing my boundaries. I'm not a runner. That's not for me. You wouldn't see me do a marathon. However, weight training and kind of music is really important to me. I've always been a music person. Quite eclectic music, but I like a lot of dance music as well. I do like all sorts of different, like jazz and all sorts, but I like, so dance music, weight training, that really helps me. And I make sure I create space. So yeah, I've got 2 children, I've got a busy life, but I will ensure I'm up 2-3 mornings. So when I drop my daughter off at school, I will go straight to the gym, and that is my time. And I take that hour out. I don't look at my phone. The other thing I don't tend to do of an evening, I will put my phone to the side. I will not sit there and scroll. I would say that's a really important thing to note that everybody could maybe try and do, because I don't think when you get into that habit, it really has an impact. So I don't engage with anything like that of an evening. And I think for me as well, I have a constant dialogue with myself. I surround myself with good people as well. So good people who, if I know I need to talk, I've got a handful of people who I think, right, and can we just have 5 minutes? And I'm able to talk. I think nature as well, just getting out. And one of the key things for me, other than the weight training, is water. Now, obviously, I'm lucky enough to live in a city that is a port city. So I'm surrounded by water, and we live right by the River Mersey. So I often will drive and just look at water, and it just has an instant calming of me. And I think what it is whatever works for you. It's finding something that just kind of just takes your brain from there to there, and you can instantly feel a sense of calm. Now, it may take people a little while to kind of find that. And I know a lot of people obviously very easily can slip into, a glass of wine or, this or that. But I think when you find something, a really good habit, it's the consistency of it. So you might not get the huge benefit from it straight away. But if it's something you enjoy, do it often. Build it into your week. And I notice the difference if I don't have, my training sessions, if I don't kind of like take myself by water, or if I don't take any time out for myself outside of the family. And see that it's another key thing. It's important for you to admit and say to yourself, I need space from my family.
Yeah.
That is okay to say that, but I think a lot of people feel a responsibility, or it's one of those unsaid things again of, I must be there 24/7 all of the time. Well, no, it's not good for you, and it's probably not good for them. So
Absolutely.
It's okay to take some time for yourself, whatever that may be, and have that consistency throughout your weeks, because it's the consistency that keeps you well and builds your resilience, I think.
It's the quality, isn't it, of the time we spend with people, not necessarily the quantity. There's nothing I can argue with anything that you've said there. When you were talking about the glass of wine or just the scrolling on the phone, which I'm, hold my hands up and do a bit of both of those as well. But I always remember a colleague I had many years ago, and he always used to talk about the difference between relaxing and collapsing, as he used to put it. And he used to say, most people, what they describe as relaxing, they're just collapsing. It's, having those few drinks, or it's just the mindless scrolling on the phone. Whereas he said relaxing is something much more mindful and something that you are making a conscious decision to do. All of those things you've just described that nurture and nourish you, and yes, may take even a little bit of effort, but that effort leads to a sense of well-being, calmness, and charging those batteries. So, thank you for that. Thank you to Gemma for talking to us today, and thank you for listening in. Links to hear more about the work of Helplines Partnership will be listed in the show notes below. This podcast is brought to you by the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, a professional home for counsellors, psychotherapists, and over 120 wellbeing organisations across the UK. Autonomy, diversity, creativity, and community are at the heart of what we do. We're creating a positive space for conversations with people who share common beliefs and goals, because together, our voice is louder. If you would like to know more about the NCPS, please visit www.ncps.com for more information. And please remember to follow and subscribe to this podcast so you're always part of the conversation.